Hello, my name is Austin, and I'd like to break down a scene for you today.
Today I would like to delve into one of the many abstract scenes from Gaspar Noé's Enter the Void, this scene being the DMT trips. However, before we attempt to dissect this scene, for both its technical and artistic value, it is important to find the method behind the madness. If you know about Gaspar Noé, you most likely know of him due to his highly eccentric personality and films that, due to their content, have us often asked the question of why we watch films. His films generally deal with the harsh brutality of life and hit hard with disturbing themes and visuals. Even if you walk out of films such as Enter the Void and can't say the experience that you had was one of enjoyment, it's almost impossible to deny the genius that Noé brings to the table. And thus, that's why I'm here to praise just one of his scenes, based on my pure admiration for his directorial style. Enter the Void is one of the most ambitious films of all time that philosophically looks at life and death in an abstract manner. It presents to the viewer a nightmarish but albeit also quite beautiful view of the world in a drug-induced state that contains some of the most incredible visualizations in a film. Despite its incredibly disturbing scenes, I would recommend this to anyone looking for something new to watch, since this very well could be the most strange film I've ever seen. So what does this scene exactly entail, you might be asking? Well, here's a brief summary before we delve into the scene. It's a 5, almost 6-minute scene of the film's protagonist, Oscar, getting high on a drug called DMT, a psychedelic drug that is said to give you an out-of-body experience where you are subject to crazed visuals. The drug, despite only having a few brief appearances in the film, serves as a perfect symbol for the film and its style. For one, the out-of-body experience of DMT fits in with the plot, seeing as almost half the film is taking place from the perspective of dead Oscar, whose soul is out of his body, and floating around Tokyo witnessing events unfold. However, more than anything else, this scene sets up a visual scheme, since the whole film is seemingly like one big trip with crazy neon visuals. Both this scene and the movie are inspired by Gaspar Noé's experience with ayahuasca, a drink filled with DMT that is legal in the Amazonian jungle, and the trip that he had on it. And while I don't necessarily condone drug use, it sure does make for a damn good scene. Without further ado, let's jump into how this scene was cut up. Gaspar Noé is able to quite effectively get the feeling of slowly slipping into the DMT state of consciousness by slowly easing the viewer into the DMT-inspired visuals, which are quite incredible by themselves. What I mean by the slow ease is that the scene never directly cuts from the drugs or from Oscar into the full-blown threshold, but rather uses neat techniques to show the slow slip out of consciousness. This begins with the first transition out of the room into the trip state that is done by the camera moving up to see the ceiling as the ceiling slowly melts away, revealing a whole new world. While at face value, one may not see this as such an important transition, it is important to note just how different this scene would feel without it. Here's the exact same clip, but with a cut from the drug itself to the trip. It loses that feeling of slowly slipping away into what feels like another dimension that this small but oh so important cut is able to do. The two other times the scene cuts from Oscar to the DMT trip rather than the drugs to the trip. In these cuts, the scene utilizes interesting techniques to wean the viewers into the trance. As seen here, there's a short 1-second splice clip of the upcoming visual starting to burst out that is followed by Oscar again and then back to the full-fledged thing. Here is the same scene with that glimpse of the coming visual edited out. There's a pretty clear divide between the scenes even with only a 1-second difference. While quite minuscule, differences such as these can heavily change how the viewer views the scene. In the edited version, it's a very lazy cut that gets the idea across that Oscar has gone from the slight consciousness back to the trip very suddenly, whereas in the original version, we easily get the idea that the trickle into DMT visuals is much more slow and gradual. It's always great when you see films attempting to add small editing tricks in order to get a certain feel across to the viewer, which I'm pretty sure is exactly what is done here. Lastly, we have my favorite transition that uses the flicking of a lighter in order to bring about the images. This is done by a small piece of the coming imagery appear every time Oscar tries to relight his DMT, which does an incredible job at blurring the crazy visual world and the real world together. Again, here's the same clip with it cutting straight from Oscar to the trip. It loses its unique appeal and ruins the feeling of the DMT trip blending with the real world. It's these small but oh so important edits that really define this scene and perfectly blend the DMT with the real world and show us a glimpse of what the real process of tripping on DMT is like. Due to the complexity of this cut, I think it's important to slow it down. In the slowed down version of the scene, we can see the first flash, then a second, and then a short clip of the coming visuals as seen in the previous example, and then to the visuals themselves. Let's slow it down even more and show frame by frame how the visuals come into play. First, almost the entire frame cuts to black. It's important to note that a small bit of the lighter's flame can be seen in the blackness after. Even though Oscar can no longer be seen and the small burst of the visual is not yet there, this small flame is shown for this short amount of time to transition these frames together and to further trick the mind into realizing that the visual is brought on by the DMT itself. When the image does appear, its center is directly where the flame was. This is to reiterate how the colors are bursting from the flame. One of the most unique components of this scene is its point of view shots that you have almost certainly noticed by now. The POV shots are not only interesting visually and very pleasing to the eye, but also a fitting choice due to the fact that the drug that is used gives you an out-of-body experience. It's due to this contrast between the shots above Oscar and from within the head of Oscar that outline how it would feel to be on DMT. By going beyond the reason of the POV shots and its fittingness in the scene, it is important to note just how technically incredible these point of view shots are. Oftentimes, POV can create motion sickness or headaches if the motion is too volatile or the blur of the camera is too sharp. Here's a POV scene from the video game film Doom. While it is quite apparent that the scene is intended to mirror that of modern first-person shooters, it is also clear to see just how bad the point of view scene is. Unlike the Enter the Void scene, here the gun is placed in an unrealistic spot that does not mirror how a view would be if it was from an actual character. In the actual Doom video game, this POV worked due to its cartoonish visuals. On top of that, a hand can still be seen on the gun, which adds a certain amount of realism to it. The scene, however, is bad not only due to its awful lighting, but due to the fact that nothing makes logistical sense. Whereas in Enter the Void, it is quite apparent that so much effort was put in to make sure that you would feel like you were Oscar and having the experiences along with him. I was sadly not able to find any behind-the-scenes clips to show how the scene's POV aspect were filmed. I'll assume the camera was placed in the middle of the actor's face to make sure the anatomy of Oscar from the first-person view made sense. They also did a great job of ensuring that head movement was kept to a minimum in order to make sure that the scene didn't feel nauseating as many POV scenes fell prey to. The pipe in which Oscar smokes out of was also positioned at a perfect location in order to get across the feeling that it was actually in your own mouth. Sometimes when we watch films, directors meticulously control a scene to create an atmosphere for the audience. Sometimes this control even includes the placement of objects in a frame. Let's take the shot of Oscar's apartment for example. As simple as it looks at first, it's fairly evident that certain objects are placed in certain locations either for a symbolic purpose or an atmospheric purpose. For starters, the enter sign, beyond simply referencing the title and transitioning the credits into the film, serves as a symbolic piece beckoning the viewer to enter the DMT state. While it could be a coincidence, and that could be said for all the object placement I talk about here, it's hard for me to believe that it's simply a happenstance that the enter sign is placed right in the middle of the frame above the DMT. Even if the viewer does not key in that there is some form of symbolic purpose for the sign, the neon word enter clearly connects to the themes of the film and sets up for the neon style for the scene, while also serving as a perfect center point for the eye during the whole scene. Next, let's look at the spherical object and the game controller's visual connection. When the lights are on completely, as can be seen here, it is clear that these are two unrelated objects in an apartment. However, when the drugs are brought into the frame and the camera focuses on the apparatus, thus blurring out the apartment, the game controller and the spherical object create a completely different full image. The spherical object now looks very much like a human head since the blurring hides the detail that shows it as an inanimate object. The game controller also looks quite like a hand, and the TV now can be mistaken as the back of a chair. By placing these objects where they are, the viewer gets tricked into thinking someone is sitting in the room with Oscar, even when there is nothing there, which creates a very neat, unsettling feeling. Now I will totally admit that maybe these objects were simply placed here and it was never its intended purpose to create this image of the back of a man in a chair. But knowing how crazy in-depth Gaspar Noé goes, I wouldn't put anything past him. The last part is to simply talk about all the clutter in the room. Almost every square inch of the apartment is filled with DVDs, posters, clothes, and trash, which fill the frame to the brim with visual stimulation that almost box the viewer in, creating a claustrophobic feeling. Going even further than the placement, let's look at the framing of the scene and just how exceptional it is here. When looking at framing, it's important to look at all aspects of the frame and to see how it presents itself to the eye. First, let's look at the scene with the rule of thirds in play. When we place a basic rule of thirds grid over top of this scene, we notice a few things. For one, it reiterates my previous comment in the object placement about the drugs in relation to the enter sign. When the drugs are first consumed before the room begins to have breathtaking colors flashing around, we clearly see that the enter sign stays in the top sector and does not move, and drugs are centralized at the bottom in its own sector. The left and right sectors, however, simply act as blurred out clutter that is not clearly visible, but box in the frame and force the viewer to only pay attention to the middle column. Next, when the screen goes black for a bit and then comes back in a more drug-induced state of reality, we see the images within the sectors have moved and are wobbling in and out of their original position. The enter sign begins to move up and down from the top middle sector to the very middle sector. This creates an almost dizzying and disorienting feeling that connects to the feeling of getting high. When the scene transitions out from the POV and moves the camera above Oscar, it still always keeps the drugs in the focal point by placing it in the middle of the screen. Even when the camera begins to spiral around Oscar, the drugs never leave the middle column, even when all other elements of the frames are all over the sectors. Due to the fact that the very middle of the frame is generally where a viewer will look in a scene, it serves as an almost stationary-like focal point as Oscar spirals out of control, creating a disorienting feel. Last, but certainly not least, I feel like it's important to talk about the excellent sound design at play during this entire scene. Just give this part a listen and pay attention to the creepy vibes given off by the ambient sounds as well as the reverb on Oscar's voice. As subtle as it may be, the audio in this clip truly adds to the feel of the scene. Early on, we hear a low-pitched droning sound that continues throughout. As the audio continues, however, we can hear what even sounds like people talking, which adds to the feeling of someone being in the room, as I talked about before. Moving on to the DMT visuals, the sound becomes more vibrant and varying, while still keeping the same low-pitched sounds. In this section, we can hear audio that seems to almost relate to the visuals at hand. While it may just be my interpretation, the visuals here remind me of thick vegetation in a jungle, and the audio seems like the sounds of leaves and branches rustling in the wind.
This has been Os on Scene Breakdown. Thanks for watching.